me. Right. I'm Catherine Sperling. I'm a Doctor of Military History.
Margaret Hadfield, professional artist, and I'm doing it through classes and various means.
So it's...
You also served, didn't you?
I served in the Navy, yes, but that was a Navy when we had to leave when we got married or pregnant.
How long did you serve for?
Only 2 years, 2 months. And then I met a bloke and we basically, that was the end of the career.
Well, that career, because
That
then
career,
you went into
and then
teaching.
Yes, and then I went to university and got a few degrees and started to teach at the University of New South Wales, the Australian Defence Force Academy, and I stayed there from 96 to 2011. And I've just been lecturing overseas occasionally and writing books. It's what I love. It's my passion. Marg and I met in 2008, and it was unusual to find a woman who painted military art. I was quite amazed, and there are very few women who write military history, so it was a case of we immediately pinged off each other, and we've been inspiring each other further and further in this field.
I think it really developed in your book on Bomber Command, because my family come from a Dutch island in the North Sea where there were 9 Australians buried there, and it was one of our first trips was to go to Holland where my parents come from, and so that it became a book,
Yes.
Grave Too Far Away.
We spent a long time looking at graves.
Yeah, we were excited by the same things.
But we were just
16 graveyards
Yeah.
in a few weeks. It happened quite by accident for me, because I was a friend, a boyfriend took me to Gallipoli, and really that's where my journey into military history in my art form started to take place. And it when I came back from Gallipoli, I just wanted to paint what I was feeling. So it's just using my creative ability with my art ability and painting to take my art into another step, into another stage, and explore history and into my art. So I just didn't want to paint pretty pictures anymore. So it's more of an exploration, not unlike climbing a mountain. There was a moment, and I'm pretty sure it happens to most people when you're in this place of great Australian history, and certainly England and France and other countries involved as well as Turkey. It's a place where it really affects you. It affects you by the sheer numbers, the great loss that happened in this small space of tract of land. And so on top of Pluggy's Plateau, one of the first little peaks we went to, I had this incredible sense of spirits of the past coming to me. And I didn't know how that was going to happen, but when I started painting, it came to me, the ideas came to me. So I allow them to flow. I do go into a subconscious kind of level and let things happen. So that's how it happened. But at the same time, when I delve back into my youth, my parents came through the occupation of Holland. And my father was a bit obsessed with war movies, and I, as a young child, were taken to these horrific war movies. They did have an impact. And I was also taken to museums when I was younger. So they took me back to Holland. So those things did have an impact. And so my interest was reignited by a visit to Gallipoli.
I think the same sort of background that Margaret had. My father was in Bomber Command and was depressed most of his life because of what he'd had to do in the war. My brother was in the army and I joined the Navy, so we had a very strong military background. And I have associated, I'm a war widow. I've been a war widow, Vietnam war widow, since I was 56, which my husband died prematurely of melanoma, and the Navy took responsibility for that. So I have mixed with a lot of widows and families young children who've been left without a father or mother now. And that really has made an impact on me. And if I can just add to what Margaret was saying, is that her vision in Gallipoli and since has been a very emotive one. She hasn't been just painting pictures of charging troops up hills. That has been the common theme of military history and military art. And that is how I saw a lot of my books, was the fact that when I was reading military history, I'm thinking, it's all about the generals, it's all about these guys charging up hills and firing guns. It's not about the 17-year-old who is terrified on a ship that's under attack and he's paralysed, or a 19-year-old who writes, "What more can I give?" It's about the families, the women who never marry because their fiancé has been killed and she's never been able to get over that. And I think Margaret's art, she puts in this emotion of the men who have been sacrificed. And I write about that too, and the legacy of what has been left behind. And there's so many broken families. There's so much tragedy. It's not just about guys charging up hills, and it's not about generals. It's about a young man who says to me, "What more can I give? I was only 19." Well, this was a great story that Marg and I put together, I guess, really, in our minds and We were in the Netherlands looking for the graves of some of these bomber boys for the book that I was writing. That was a grave too far away, and we'd met the families of these men, and it was just, we were looking for this. They weren't in a Commonwealth grave, they were in a little church grave. So we were looking for the church in this little village in the Netherlands, and we came across this grave with children's trinkets. Margaret's done amazing artwork, I think, here, and it's exactly how it was. This is the medals that the brother gave me of one of the pilot, Michael Scott. And we found all this. It was raked, and there were children's trinkets, and the word bedankt.
Bedankt. Bedankt is thank you in Dutch, which we just even now makes me emotional. It's basically, we learnt later on that the children of the nearby school take care of the graves. So every year they would learn about the service and sacrifice of the men in their graveyard. Now you've got two Australians, one Brit and two Australians. That's a full crew who had died in nearby town, near this churchyard.
And we found the teacher.
Yeah,
She's the grade 6 teacher, and every time a grade 6 class comes through, she takes them over here and tells them the stories of these Australian boys and the Brit who died trying to save the Netherlands from the enemy. What's
really nice is the way they are taking care of the graves. This has happened across Holland a lot. Can't speak for the other countries. They take care of the graves, and they continue today to just appreciate their freedom and what these men did and lost their lives. So being in Holland and visiting some graves when I was 9 years old, and this sort of all comes back. I was shown graves of airmen, basically, who died on the little island of Terschelling, where my family come from. It's a 25-kilometre island, but I know now bodies were washed onto the beach. It was a beach not unlike Bondi Beach, for example. It was a big beach. And my parents, I did learn about that happening. And so it is all part of my history as well, and that's why I was able to recognise bedankt as being, that's thank you. And so being able to just relate to it when I was a child as well, and hearing the stories from my father, who was I'd say a little bit of an underground person in the war. It wasn't an organised underground, but he did his own little brand of havoc during the war. And he did some art posters during the war to promote the Dutch Navy, for example, and he got into some trouble and they raided the house. The Germans raided the house. They got a little bit of a tip-off and they were able to remove a lot of the products that he had made to make a few dollars. And it's interesting. So they left the island and went into Amsterdam for quite some time. So because they knew they were being felt they were being hunted by the Germans. For my father doing his little artworks. Funny story.
Yeah. And we went to Terschelling to see some Australian graves.
Yeah.
And the word gets out very quickly. And we had a fellow who came and he used to help his father pick up the bodies. That was part of his duty, was to pick up the bodies for the Germans on the island and to bury them. And he came and introduced himself. And that was an incredible story. The fact that this fellow, you know, it was
11 years old.
Yes, and then they all started to come from all over the place, and somebody came with a little tile
that my father had painted during the war.
Yes, well, my father was on a Halifax bomber. He did 1.5 tours on Halifax bombers during World War II. So the air has always been terribly important to me. He came back very depressed because they didn't mind bombing military installations, but then they were told to bomb cities. And it had a profound effect on the bomber crews, but they had no choice. They were told they had to go out. They were young men. My father had just recently married before he went overseas. So the story of these bombermen is just always close to my heart. And I know how depressed, I didn't realise it as a child, but how depressed he was. He wouldn't speak about it until my own sons were teenagers and they kept pestering, "What'd you do in the war, Granddad?" And by the time he died, I think he'd shot down half the Luftwaffe because the story had just expanded in his own memory. But he had crash landed a couple of times in England. He had his crew shot up dreadfully. So that has to stay with someone. And it does go down generations. Even if you don't realise it, subconsciously it is coming down. And you can't understand why your dad is depressed, or you know that there's something not quite right. He'd disappear. Some of the books I've written about the sailors, they disappeared to a bridge, under a bridge together and drank. It's just that they were so traumatised by their experience. And I think this is what Margaret and I are conveying in our books and paintings, is that war is traumatising everybody, not just the men who go and the women who go. It's lasting forever. We've met the families of these people and they still discuss the grief. We do, when we interview these broken families, we take a lot of it on ourselves, which is difficult. But Margaret can get it out in her painting, in her artwork, to a degree, obviously. And I express my emotions through my books. And
I think, just listening to the stories, and also those families, to have someone listen to them, we are helping them, because they also then feel a bit more valued. And when we include them, when Catherine includes them in her books and I include them in my paintings, they feel a greater sense of, they can live with it a bit easier, that someone has listened to the story, you know, or acknowledged their son or their brother and so forth. So it's still a very strong part of their lives.
yeah, we're not. I guess we're not anti-Defence Forces. The guys, the women and the men who are in the Defence Forces, we have utmost respect for. But when you're sitting down interviewing a fellow whose brother was shot down in World War II, and he shows you a photograph of him before his brother left for war, and he's about this high, and the god is this high. He is just an amazing looking fellow, and he was shot down when he went to war. And this fellow, who was in his 80s, he just turned to Margaret and I and he said, "Do you know that you are the only people in all of these years who have asked me how much I've missed my brother?"
Yeah, that even makes me upset right
it does.
now.
And it's, I mean, he was close to death, this fellow, but he never got over the loss of his big hero, his big brother. And of course, the graves are so far away, which is why I call this book A Grave Too Far Away, because where these bomber boys particularly were shot down in various parts of Europe and the Middle East, the families couldn't afford to go and see them. They never saw them. So we're not glorifying war and we're not almost glorifying misery. It's just that, you know, on a tombstone there's, "I'm not forgotten as long as someone mentions my name." And a lot of the people who are in those graveyards in Europe are 18, 17. It is, they never got to really live.
And I think you've just got to appreciate history to live today. You have to understand where we've all come from. And it's, you know, it's such a strong part of our history. To us, it's really important to remember them. And it is, lest we forget, we must remember them. Whether they fought or it was an accident or however it happened, we should remember.